Do Christians and Muslims worship the same God? Dr. Craig, perhaps by the end of this podcast, will know. But this has been quite a controversy. It began at Wheaton College.
My alma mater.
Yes. Christianity Today and other publications have picked up on this. Of course, if you're familiar with Wheaton, it's an evangelical school in suburban Chicago. School's official press release has stated that the college placed Dr. Larcia Hawkins on leave in response to significant questions regarding the theological implications of statements that she had made about the relationship of Christianity to Islam. According to Christianity Today, Dr. Hawkins drew international attention after she publicly announced on Facebook that she would don the Muslim hijab as part of her Advent worship in order to, quote, stand in religious solidarity with Muslims because they, like her, a Christian, are people of the book. And, as Pope Francis stated last week, we worship the same God. Obviously, controversy here at your alma mater.
Yes, indeed. And she was finally released from the college because she could not apparently satisfy the administration that her beliefs in this regard were consistent with orthodoxy.
The college has, in their release, the president notes, Philip Ryken, president of Wheaton, notes, the college has no stated position on the wearing of headscarves as a gesture of care and concern for those in Muslim or other religious communities that may face discrimination or persecution. So the hijab is a headscarf worn by Muslim women. And so that's not the issue. Apparently, Bill, it was the issue of whether we are both people of the book and whether we worship the same God.
That was the real crux of the issue, was her claim that Christians and Muslims worship the same God.
On top of this, Dr. Frank Beckwith has written an article saying that she's right about Muslims and Christians worshiping the same God, and she should not have been dismissed from the Wheaton faculty for implicitly denying the school's statement of faith. He says it's important to point out that she's wrong about Christians and Muslims being people of the book, however. So, Bill, you've kind of been through Beckwith's statements here. Two things it looks like. Do Christians and Muslims worship the same God, and are we people of the book?
Yeah, I find myself on an opposite side here with Frank, who is a good friend, fellow member of the Evangelical Philosophical Society, and a person that I've collaborated with both in writing projects as well as in conferences. And so it's very interesting to me to see the sort of defense that he gives for the claim that Christians and Muslims do, in fact, worship the same God.
He says that we are not people of the book because in Islamic theology, the phrase people of the book refers only to followers of other Abrahamic religions.
Right. She clearly made a misstep there where she said that we're all people of the book, because when the Quran mentions the people of the book, they mean Jews and Christians. And they called them that because of their belief in the authority of the Bible. And so for Muslims, when you talk about the people of the book, you mean Jews and Christians. You're not talking about yourselves as Muslims. And so she's made I think, a minor misstep in characterizing Christians and Muslims as both being people of the book.
Okay. Is there the only way I guess you can compare it is that we both would look to a particular collection of books, in our case, and the Quran, in the Muslims' case, as being authoritative or inspired from God. And so that we both have our sacred scriptures, but people of the book has a specific denotation.
Oh, yeah, that's right. That's a technical term in the Quran that has a specific usage. And I think this is a minor point, but she does get that wrong, what that phrase means.
Well, let's read from Dr. Beckwith's article. He says, Now on to the big question. Do Muslims and Christians worship the same God? To answer it well, we have to make some important philosophical distinctions. First, what does it mean for two terms to refer to the same thing? Take, for example, the names Muhammad Ali and Cassius Clay. Although they are different terms, they refer to the same thing, the boxer. For each has identical properties. Whatever is true of Ali is true of Clay and vice versa. And you can do the same thing with Robert Zimmerman and Bob Dylan. Robert Zimmerman is Bob Dylan's real name. Norma Jean Baker and Marilyn Monroe. They're the same person. So the fact that Christians may call God Yahweh and Muslims call God Allah makes no difference if both gods have identical properties.
All right, let me interrupt there, Kevin, and comment. Beckwith, as a philosopher, construes this question as about the theory of reference. What does it mean to refer to the same thing? And this is a profound philosophical issue that actually lies very much at the heart of the work that I've been doing on God and abstract objects. How do terms refer to objects? And he asks the question, what does it mean for two terms to refer to the same thing? These are called co-referring terms. Two different words, two terms, refer to the same object or referent or denotation. And he answers gives the example of Muhammad Ali and Cassius Clay, and then he says, although they are different terms, they refer to the same thing. Why? For each has identical properties. So he's laying out here a sufficient condition for two terms to be co-referring. And it would seem to be the following, saying if the reference of two terms have identical properties, then the terms refer to the same things. So if the reference or the denotations of two terms have identical properties, then these two terms are co-referring. They both refer to the same thing. And we can accept that for the sake of argument. Let's accept that that's a sufficient condition for two terms referring to the same thing, namely the reference or the objects of those terms have identical properties. So now he wants to apply this to terms for God. And he says, so the fact that Christians may call God Yahweh and Muslims call God Allah makes no difference if both gods have identical properties. So what he's trying to show is that in the case of Allah and Yahweh, this sufficient condition that he stated is fulfilled. Remember, that sufficient condition is that if the reference or denotations of two terms have identical properties, then the terms refer to the same thing. And so he's arguing that if the reference of Yahweh and Allah have identical properties, then these two terms refer to the same thing. And I think we can accept that for the sake of argument. Mm-hmm. The problem is, Kevin, that Yahweh and Allah do not have the same properties. And although Muslims and Christians may both embrace classical theism, a kind of generic monotheism, the Muslim concept of God and the Christian concept are very different concepts. In my own work, I have focused upon the Trinitarian nature of God in Christianity in contrast to Islam, which is a Unitarian doctrine of God. It believes God is just one person, whereas we Christians believe God is three persons. I also think that the nature of God in Islam is radically different than God's nature in Christianity, in that the God of the Bible is an all-loving God who has universal, unconditional love for all people. And that's very different from the God of the Quran, who is not all-loving, who has no love for unbelievers and non-Muslims, but reserves his love only for those who do the confession and pay alms. And then God will assign love to them. So you have in Islam and Christianity gods which appear to have different properties, if they exist, and therefore don't fulfill this sufficient condition that Frank has stated, that if the reference of Yahweh and Allah are identical in their properties, then the two terms refer to the same thing. It would seem that that condition isn't fulfilled, and therefore his argument fails. Now, Frank, as a good philosopher, is well aware of this problem.
Yeah, he anticipates it.
He anticipates it, and he will go on then to appeal to a well-known phenomenon of referring to something by means of a false description. And why don't you read that section of the article?
He begins, but doesn't Christianity affirm that God is a Trinity while Muslims deny it? Wouldn't this mean that they indeed worship different gods? Not necessarily. Consider this example. Imagine that Fred believes that the evidence is convincing that Thomas Jefferson sired several children with his slave, Sally Hemings. And thus Fred believes that Thomas Jefferson has the property of being a father to several of Sally Hemings' children. On the other hand, suppose Bob does not find the evidence convincing and thus believes that Thomas Jefferson does not have the property of being a father to several of Sally Hemings' children. Would it follow from this that Fred and Bob do not believe that the third president of the United States was the same man? Of course not. In the same way, Abraham and Moses did not believe that God is a Trinity, but St. Augustine, St. Thomas Aquinas, and Billy Graham do. Does that mean that Augustine, Aquinas, and Graham do not worship the same God as Abraham and Moses? Again, of course not. The fact that one may have incomplete knowledge or hold a false belief about another person, whether human or divine, does not mean that someone who has better or truer knowledge about that person is not thinking about the same person.
Right. All right. What he's talking about here is the phenomenon of referring to something under a false description of that thing. Let me illustrate. Suppose you and I are observing a couple walking down the street and their behavior toward one another. And I remark to you, her husband is kind to her. And we both know whom I'm referring to. I'm talking about that man that we're looking at, who's walking and being kind to this lady. But suppose, in fact, that that's not her husband, that it's somebody else that she's walking with. And suppose that her husband is, in fact, mean and nasty and cruel to her. In that case, my sentence, her husband is kind to her, would be literally false if you take it to refer to her husband, because he's not kind to her. But we meant to refer to the man we're observing, that he is kind to her. And so I have successfully referred to this man under a false description of him. I've used a literally false description in referring to this person. And so Frank wants to suggest that this is what happens with Christianity and Islam. He says the fact that one may have incomplete knowledge or hold a false belief about another person doesn't mean that someone who has better or truer knowledge about that person is not thinking about the same person. And that's right. You can refer to someone under a false description. But notice, Kevin, it doesn't mean that he is thinking about the same person. Maybe the conceptions are so fundamentally different that the terms are not co-referring. For example, earlier in his article, he talks about the virgin birth and the immaculate conception. And he points out that many Protestants don't understand the distinction between these two. So imagine an ignorant Protestant who thinks that these terms refer to the same thing. The virgin birth and the immaculate conception both refer to Jesus being born of a virgin. Now, that person might say that he and the Catholic believe the same thing, except that the Catholic just uses a different term for Jesus being born of a virgin. Namely, the Catholic refers to this as the Immaculate Conception, and I'm referring to it as the virgin birth, but we both believe the same thing, namely that Jesus was born of a virgin, but we refer to it with these two different terms, Immaculate Conception and virgin birth. Well, supposedly then that he finds out that Catholics are not referring to Jesus' virgin birth when they talk about the Immaculate Conception, that they're in fact referring to Mary's being born without original sin. Would he now continue to say that he and the Catholic mean the same thing by their terms? No, he would now say, oh, well, the Catholic was referring to something else when he talked about the Immaculate Conception. So, apply that to the God of the Bible and the God of the Quran. Is this just a case of referring to the same God under a false description in one case? Or are they in fact referring to two deities? Just like someone talking about the Immaculate Conception, the virgin birth, are really referring to two different things. What Frank has not done in his article is he hasn't given us the necessary conditions for two terms to be co-referring. He has given us sufficient conditions for when two terms are co-referring, but he hasn't told us what conditions must be met for the two terms to be co-referring. And so his his argument simply doesn't go through, and the article ends too abruptly at this point. He has only shown that if two referents have identical properties, then the terms refer to the same thing. But he hasn't shown us under what conditions you must be referring to the same thing when they have radically different properties. Now, when I deal with this question, Kevin, in my work on Christianity and Islam, I think that it's best just to avoid these problems that arise from reference by asking instead about the Muslim and Christian concepts of God. Do the Muslim and the Christian have the same concept of God? And here I think we can argue that the conceptions of God in Christianity and Islam are so fundamentally different that they're not the same God. And it's not just a matter of the Trinity being different, it's also a matter, as I say, about the very moral character of God. I think that the Islamic conception of God is a morally defective concept because God is not an all-loving being. He loves conditionally. Only those who first love him, say the confession and pay the alms, do the prayers, those are the ones that God loves. And I was very interested, Kevin, in looking into this whole controversy at Wheaton, that Miroslav Volf, who is a well-known evangelical theologian who has also defended Professor Hawkins by saying Muslims and Christians worship the same God, recognizes these fundamental differences between the Islamic and Muslim conceptions of God. Here's what he says in the Washington Post. He says, in addition to contesting the Trinity and the incarnations, Muslims also contest the Christian claim that God is love, unconditional and indiscriminate love. There is no claim in Islam that God justifies the ungodly and no command to love one's enemies. But these are the signature claims of Christian faith. Take the redemption of the ungodly and the love of the enemy out of the Christian faith, and you unchristian it. He says, I wish that those who insist that Christians worship an altogether different God than Muslims latched on to this difference, that instead of wanting to end Muslims they deem to be their enemies in the name of God, they would seek to embrace them in the name of Christ. If they did so, they would need to show how struggle against enemies is a way of loving them, an argument that many great theologians in the past were willing to make. And I think that Volf here sees the fundamentally different conceptions of God in Islam and Christianity with respect to the moral character of God. and God's being an all-loving being, which is radically different, as he says, from the Muslim concept of God. And so in my view, rather than mask over these differences and attempt to have schmoozy interfaith dialogue to say we all believe in the same God and we really worship the same deity, we need to draw clear lines of differentiation and honestly talk about our differences.
Well, Bill, because that's exactly what's going to happen here, probably from the Christianity Today article and just from what I've seen blow up on the internet from Frank's article, and that is there's going to be a lot of schmooze. There is going to be a lot of schmoozy, we're just worshiping the same God, and that could cause downright confusion.
See, someone like Wolf thinks that in a world which is riven by jihadism and interreligious strife, that we need to do everything we can to promote peaceful coexistence and get along with each other. I think the demands of the day are much different. I think in an age of increasing religious relativism and ontological pluralism, that we need to emphasize the clear differences between Christianity and Islam, and that is a way of loving one's neighbor. And the Muslims with whom I've dialogued and that I've talked to have appreciated my honesty in differentiating the Christian concept of God from the Islamic concept of God, and have appreciated the arguments that I have given for the superior truth of the Christian conception. We can do this in love without promoting strife and hate, precisely because we as Christians worship a God who commands us to love all people, just as he does, unconditionally.
Bill, this brings up two more quick issues that I can see. One is the implications for Mormons, for the Latter-day Saint Church here. Do they worship the same God they claim to? And when you're reaching out to your Mormon friends with the truth of Scripture, this is an issue that's going to come up?
Yes, this is one that I thought of as I read Frank's article. Would he say that Mormons and Christians worship the same God? And here in defense of Frank, I think that he would not. He understands Mormon theology well. He's from Nevada and has had extensive experience in talking with Mormon theologians. And I think Frank would say that Mormons, in contrast to Muslims and Jews, are not classical theists. They are, in fact, polytheists who believe in humanoid, finite deities that inhabit planets in outer space and have universes under their sway, and that we're on our way to deification, and that therefore I think Frank would insist that Mormons and Christians do not worship the same God. But what he wants to say is that just as Jews and Christians worship the same God, so do Muslims and Christians worship the same God, even though Muslims do it under a false description of God. And what I've argued is that the differences between the Muslim concept of God and the Christian concept of God are so stark that Frank hasn't given us any reason to think, in view of their non-identical properties, that they are worshiping the same God. Now this occasions a different question. What about the Jew and the Christian?
Yeah.
Do Jews and Christians worship the same God? How can we say that we worship the same God that Abraham and Moses did when they didn't believe that God was a Trinity, but we do? Well, here's what I would say in response to that question. The Christian does not reject the Jewish concept of God as the Muslim explicitly rejects the Christian concept of God. The Christian finds the same God of the Old Testament more fully revealed in the New Testament. he doesn't repudiate the God of the Old Testament. He believes that the God of the Old Testament reveals himself more fully in the New Testament. By contrast, the Muslim repudiates the concept of God found in the New Testament. He said this is the result of corruption and legend, and he rejects the concept of God found in the New Testament. And so that's very different than the Christian attitude toward the God of the Jewish Old Testament. Now, on the other hand, Kevin, if I were an Orthodox Jew, then I would say that Christians have such a different concept of God that they are worshiping a different God than I am. If I were an Orthodox Jew, I would say the same thing about Christians that I think we should say about Muslims, that they are worshiping a different God than the God that I worship. And look at how the Orthodox Jews reacted to Paul's preaching of the gospel. Paul considered that he was preaching the same God of his fathers as Jews, but the Jews, the Orthodox Jews, did not agree. They thought that Paul was a heretic. So it depends on your perspective. I think from the perspective of the Orthodox Jew, he would be justified in saying Christians worship a different God, just as I think from a Christian perspective, we're justified in saying that Muslims worship a different God. And the real question here is, whose conception of God is correct?
Yeah, that's what it comes down to, doesn't it?
It really does. I think that the question of worshiping the same God is a red herring that, frankly, takes you into philosophical debates about reference that are ambiguous and unclear. Frank doesn't give us necessary and sufficient conditions for when two terms are co-referring, even though the reference have different properties. So this is a knotty philosophical question. The more important question is to show the different conceptions of God in these different religions, and then to ask, where does the evidence point? Which conception of God, if any, is the true conception of God? And so that has been the focus of my debates with Muslim apologists and theologians, to argue that the Christian concept of God is correct, whereas the Muslim concept of God is false.